Welcome to the Aero Export Consultants Podcast. I'm John Young, and this is The Point. If you're tuning in today, congratulations! You are a listener on the inaugural episode of AEC's podcast. Don't think that means we're inexperienced here, however. I've researched and written several podcast episodes with AEC's strategic ally, Evolutions in Business, who we partner with for much of our work in the export compliance field. This will likely be a monthly podcast, as I will continue to write scripts for EIB's podcast moving forward for the foreseeable future. So if you like what you hear here, then I suggest you check out some episodes of EIB's podcast as well. You can find it under the name EIB Export News. But until then, thank you for tuning into The Point, where I'll break down news and helpful information in the export compliance field. Whether it's reports on important international events or breakdowns of new regulations in EAR and ITAR, it's my aim to take the overwhelming amount of information and condense it down for you. Because at AEC, our goal is research done right and compliance made simple. So to start this new podcast, I want to begin with the biggest story we can, which is obviously the recent election of President Donald Trump. Not to worry, I'll try and steer clear of the politics for the subject and focus on what really matters for those of us in the export compliance field and manufacturing. Foreign policy and trade policy for the second term of Trump's administration with a focus on export compliance. The good news is we already have a first term's worth of policy decisions to base our predictions off of for the second term. We'll be able to analyze some of President Trump's first-term actions on trade and foreign policy and infer what paths he will resume when he has assumed office again. The bad news is that we have a whole new host of global events and deals that occurred during President Biden's presidency that have had serious effects on trade relationships and global relationships in general. We can continue to guess how President Trump will act in the face of these events based on his words and mentality towards foreign policy, but we're not mind readers here at AEC. These will be inferences and assumptions, based in data, yes, but I am unable to definitively predict what will occur over the next 4 years. With that in mind, I've separated this episode into 4 separate sections that will likely be of high importance to Trump's administration and will likely have large implications for export compliance in the U.S. The 4 sections are China, Russia and Ukraine, the Middle East, and the home front. So let's begin with China. In case any of you need a refresher, the United States did not have a rosy relationship with China under Trump. This should be of no surprise, as we have suffered a rocky relationship with China for decades at this point. It started off fairly decent with Trump hosting President Xi at Mar-a-Lago in 2017. The result of that meeting was an expansive agreement that sought to expand trade in agricultural areas, among other sectors, though with a noted absence of discussion in metals and car parts. However, this goodwill did not last long, as in the spring of 2018, President Trump began using blistering tariffs to target China in response to the Chinese theft of U.S. technology and intellectual property. The tariffs were aimed at steel and aluminum and grew to encompass clothing and electronics. This also marked the beginning of our restriction on Chinese investment in the United States, a practice that culminated later that year in the creation of FIRMA, the Foreign Investment Risk Review Modernization Act of 2018, which was an act that strengthened and modernized CFIUS, the Committee on Foreign Investments in the U.S. FIRMA sought to, quote, address growing national security concerns over foreign exploitation of certain investment structures which traditionally have fallen outside of CFIUS's jurisdiction, end quote. And this was with a stated focus on China at the time. Trump continued to stack tariffs in 2018, escalating what would be called a trade war with China. In 2019, his administration raised tariffs from 10% to 25%, attempting to force China to make a favorable deal with the U.S., and later, China was declared a currency manipulator, along with another raise on tariffs. Eventually, a deal was reached and some tariffs were relaxed on China. The majority remained, however, and continued to be used through the Biden administration, which brings us to the current day. Biden's administration kept in place Trump's tariffs on China, and even built on the adversarial trade practices in some places. Over the past several years, we have seen increased export controls placed on China, particularly in relation to chip technology, semiconductors, AI, and other high-technology areas. Trump's second term will likely see the continuation of such policies. Already in his campaign, he has made clear that he will be fighting for American manufacturing, and will place even higher tariffs on China in order to spur domestic growth. This will likely cause another strained relationship with China and President Xi. It is possible we will see some good news from this path, however. In order to maintain our economic status during the past few years, more international trade partnerships sprung up during the Biden administration. We focused on new deals and trade with some of our allies like South Korea, Taiwan, Japan, and countries closer to home like Mexico, who became our #1 trading partner in the past few years, 2023 included. It is likely in order to combat China, these newer relationships will continue to flourish and remain a focus for Trump's second term. Taiwan and South Korea are already moving chip and semiconductor manufacturing to the United States, and hopefully will begin production at some point in the next few years. Japan likewise saw a strong relationship with America in Trump's first term, though some say that was largely due to Trump's friendship with Abe Shinzo, the former Japanese prime minister. But it stands to reason that a productive relationship should continue in Trump's second term. As an article from the Center for Strategic and International Studies put it, under Trump, the United States embraced Japan as its partner of choice in Asia, and even began to echo Abe's strategic vision of pursuing a free and open Indo-Pacific to underwrite stability and prosperity in the world's most dynamic region. Another relationship with influence in the Indo-Pacific that might receive focus is the AUKUS partnership, which CSIS calls perhaps the most significant security arrangement of the past several decades. AUKUS came about during Trump's absence from office, and what began as a nuclear submarine manufacturing partnership between the US, UK, and Australia grew into a larger trade agreement with a focus on relieving export controls between the three member nations. Given President Trump's prior adversity to China, it stands to reason that any international relationship that strengthens America and potentially weakens China's economic standpoint will be a relationship the president will show interest in. So this is a broad look at the foreign policy, but what about the trade that results from it? What will we see there? I think it stands to reason that economic sanctions and export controls will continue to be employed against China. I think we will see a doubling down on export controls for higher technology with a focus on semiconductors, quantum computing, AI, and other highly regulated technologies. AI especially, which currently exists in something of a gray area, will likely see new regulations in the next few years implemented. Trump will likely expand restrictions in that area and remain constant on the current restrictions we have against China and other areas. With heightened restrictions on China, I would expect more mobility in friendlier markets, with potential license exceptions and relaxed restrictions for allied nations like we see in the AUKUS agreement. CSIS says continued AUKUS support would be extremely welcome on the world stage, particularly for Australia. Enabling more, quote, co-production of defense material through refinement of U.S. export controls would strengthen this fledgling relationship and America itself as well. For our allies, it would be beneficial to continue productive relationships. For China, however, I would expect no relief in the next 4 years. In fact, as I record this episode, a development has occurred. Our restrictions surrounding semiconductor technology and manufacturing have strengthened, and in response, China has banned the export of several materials used in high technology to the U.S. If there is to be a second trade war in the coming administration, it appears to have already started. Now I want to move on to Russia and Ukraine. With China, we had the prior actions of Trump's administration to draw our predictions from. We are less fortunate when it comes to the war in Ukraine and America's response to Russia, both of which occurred during Joe Biden's presidency. As such, this section will likely contain more speculation on the kinds of actions Trump will take in regard to export controls placed on Russia and the types of deals that will emerge surrounding this war and its hopeful end. As listeners are likely aware, Russia's invasion of Ukraine spawned a monumental government-wide approach to sanctions and restrictions. In fact, thanks in part to our efforts, the response was not limited to America's actions, but was an international effort designed to penalize the aggression of Russia and Vladimir Putin. If you need a refresh on the specific actions taken by our government, I suggest you go and listen to previous episodes of EIB's podcast, some of which were written by me. Much has been said on what Trump's approach will be to the war and what it'll consist of, but regardless if the war ends on day one or continues on, I think it is likely that the penalties against Russia will not relent for some time. There are several reasons for this, one of which being Russia's actions in the face of our sanctions. Russia has continued to acquire dual-use technology that the U.S. has sought to deny them, and their trading partners have incurred our ire as well. What some have referred to as the new axis of evil has been born, with adversaries such as China, Iran, and North Korea supplementing the gaping hole of Western technology in Russia. See my episode of the EIB podcast on export compliance failures to hear my thoughts on American products that end up in our enemies' weaponry. Suffice to say, I am not a fan. Their continued flaunting of export controls has not endeared them to the U.S. government either. It seems every month we have a new list of Russian entities added to the sanctions list, and the net of export controls cast onto Russia has continued to expand to new products. I believe this will likely continue in Trump's second term. Any attempt to subvert U.S. authority will likely be met with penalties. This would likely translate into more export controls and sanctions, not just on Russia, but also the diversionary countries such as Belarus that assist Russia in avoiding U.S. export controls. The other actors, such as Iran, North Korea, and China, will also likely face increased penalties if they continue to assist Russia's war efforts. President Trump has stated he has no interest in war and will likely view any attempt to prolong the conflict as a challenge against U.S. interests. As for Ukraine, I imagine there will continue to be restrictions placed on export to conquered territories. Until the conflict ends, there will likely be close scrutiny on any exports destined to Ukraine. Trade might also be used as a cudgel to ensure Ukraine arrives at a potential negotiating table, but that's just pure speculation on my part. What is clear is that President Trump wishes to achieve some sort of peace in the region and will likely not rule out potential paths to reach it. It's difficult to accurately predict the actions we might take regarding an ongoing war. However, as with China, I'm confident that we will continue to penalize Russia and its allies supporting their war effort. This will continue in areas of high technology such as drones, quantum computing, semiconductors, and more. Export controls and sanctions will likely be the primary tool to achieve this, and I advise all exporters and manufacturers to continue to pay attention to the updates the government gives regarding trade in this region. I want to move now into the Middle East and the actions we can expect to see there. First, let's talk our enemies. Iran will likely remain a subject of fierce sanctions, penalties, and controls. Their continued support of Russia's war efforts have not improved their already low status with the U.S. It is impossible to say for certain what will happen in the Middle East with the various conflicts ongoing at the moment, but there are some things that will remain a constant. We will continue to pressure Iran in any way we can using trade as a primary weapon. Expect no relief for them. As long as they continue to support terror in the region and conflict in Eastern Europe, they will face the full might of the American economy. Drones, missiles, chips, anything with significant dual uses will be cracked down on as the hostilities continue. As the CSIS put it, in his first term, President Trump had a policy of maximum pressure on Iran, and, quote, the reason it did not work is because it was abandoned too soon, end quote. Current arguments seem to be for, quote, strenuously for tightening enforcement of sanctions on Iran, responding vigorously to the actions of Iranian proxies, and demonstrating a willingness to use force against Iran and its assets around the Middle East, end quote. I can see no reason currently why that strategy would be subject to change in Trump's second term, so be prepared for renewed sanctions and controls against Iran. As for our allies in the region, I can see no reason why the export control regime would change its attitude towards Israel. President Trump has made his support of Israel very clear both in his first term and his campaign, despite some disagreements with the country's leadership and the prolonged conflict against Iranian proxies. Saudi Arabia presents an interesting problem, however. According to CSIS, quote, alarm bells went off in Washington when Saudi Arabia opened its doors to Chinese investment in semiconductors, artificial intelligence, and surveillance equipment, end quote. While President Trump will likely seek a productive relationship with Saudi Arabia, I do not think he would be willing to sacrifice pressure against China to do so, when he clearly views China as a predominant threat to American interests. If Saudi Arabia continues to support China's efforts in high-technology areas the U.S. seeks to deny them, it may result in export controls directed at Saudi Arabia. This is mostly guesswork, of course, but I would pay special attention to countries that seek to assist our adversaries in areas we have a vested interest in defeating them in. I want to turn now to the home front and countries closer to us. I've actually had to rewrite this section in the last few days. News just broke of Trump's plan to levy 25% tariffs on both Canada and Mexico until the crisis at our borders and the fentanyl crisis have been addressed by our neighbors. While this may seem drastic, I believe this will likely be just another tool to force our allies to take these problems seriously. Nonetheless, they speak of turbulent days ahead. In spite of this, however, I believe trade between the three of our countries is too vital to jeopardize and will eventually settle to normal relations. Canada specifically sends 75% of its exports to the United States and will likely not find itself burdened by the tariffs the level of which we will aim at China, who also saw an increase in the recent announcement. There may be some push and pull as the United States seeks to secure its borders and interests, but I find it unlikely the relationship will suffer too much too long. Not to mention, there is an upcoming election for Canada in 2025 that might solve the issues of friction between the leaders of our countries. In terms of the export freedom we have on products to Canada, I predict that there will be no significant changes in this area. As for Mexico, we are entering a potentially dicey area. One cannot deny the immigration crisis that has rocked America during the Biden administration. This was largely allowed, if not facilitated in some ways, by Mexico. Trump has made it clear he will use any means possible to stem the tide and rectify the damage done. These threats include the newly announced tariffs placed on Mexico and the threat of not renewing the USMCA. From a purely economic viewpoint, I believe these tariffs may prove unwise, but our relationship with Mexico will likely not be viewed purely from an economic standpoint. Depending on how Trump acts and Mexico reacts to our attempts to solve the issues that plague the Biden administration, our trade with Mexico could suffer. But at the same time, this will need to be balanced with our efforts against China as well. Due to the trade war and our continued actions against China, Mexico has become our number one trading partner, a relationship we cannot afford to lose if we continue to avoid trade with China. How the situation ultimately resolves, I cannot say, but keep your eyes open and pray for swift, beneficial resolutions. Now for our own country. What does this mean for American manufacturers and businesses? It's clear that President Trump is aiming to grow American manufacturing. He has said as much on many different occasions. What we can gather from his first term and his campaign are the various methods he will employ, from tax incentives for businesses to wielding tariffs against unfriendly nations. We'll also likely see regulation reforms, making it easy for companies to do business in the United States. Bringing businesses in and strengthening existing businesses appear to be the name of the game for Trump's second term. This environment that President Trump is trying to create in the U.S. will likely be welcome among the manufacturers out there. Regarding export controls, I think this area will retain much of its status, unlike other areas that might receive a scaling back of their regulations. This administration seems poised to take the economic and military superiority very seriously over the next 4 years. Export controls are a vital tool to preserving that hegemony, and were not shied away from in Trump's first term. Trump focused heavily on emerging technologies in the first term and will likely continue to do so in his second. His restrictions on adversaries such as China, Iran, and Venezuela will likely be continued, with Russia emerging as another significant target of his restrictive policies. Where Trump focused on cybersecurity in his first term, AI has presented another variable to account for in recent years and will likely emerge as an area of concern in his second term. Those of us in the industry should remain vigilant for malicious actors that seek to subvert our security and sanctions. Where we may see some leeway is the licensing process. As an article from Reed Smith puts it, quote, "Under Trump, the Department of State Director of Defense Trade Controls, DDTC, tightened defense export controls, particularly to China and other adversaries, while streamlining licensing processes," end quote. And they also said, quote, "Under a new Trump administration, DDTC would likely continue its focus on tightening defense exports to adversaries, particularly in emerging technologies such as AI and quantum computing, while aiming to reduce regulatory barriers for U.S. defense contractors," end quote. So as I've said, emerging technologies will continue to be heavily protected, but the goal is to make manufacturing and business easier domestically. Hopefully, a balance will be managed where we can see trade flourish within our country and with our close allies, while protecting emerging and high technologies from our enemies. We've gone through what I believe will be the main areas of focus heading into the second Trump administration. These are not the only areas of concern, however. For instance, we may face more adversity from countries like Venezuela. North Korea will always be an issue, with recent actions in Russia only confirming that, and many additional challenges undoubtedly lurk around the corner. Here at AEC, we can do a lot for you, but unfortunately, we can't predict the future. This is all speculation in the end, though I like to think I've done a good job of backing it up for you. As an end note, I thought I'd take a moment reassuring people. This episode may make it seem like we're in for a lot of trouble, both with allies and enemies alike. However, I choose to see this in a good light, or at least an optimistic one. President Trump has conducted successful trade and foreign policy in his first term. The use of tariffs in such great amounts may cause anxiety, but in some cases appear to be necessary. For our allies like Mexico and Canada, he will ensure that we are treated fairly and that other existing issues between our countries will be resolved. For our enemies like China, Iran, and Russia, he will strike hard to protect our interests. Export controls will continue to be used as a tool in these interactions, as they should be. They are the economic weapons of a nation not at war, a place where we would all like to be. There will be changes to come in the next 4 years, no doubt. International relations and our means of interacting will shift and be adjusted. That's why, for all your questions and worries, for all your business needs and export compliance, for all your assistance in building secure, profitable, compliant business, contact us here at Aero Export Consultants. We're here to help you through research done right, and our work is designed to make compliance simple for you. I'm John Young, and this has been The Point.